right, y'all ready to finish chapter 7 of Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy? Phippsburg cooled into autumn, and Turner spent an hour or so every morning moving wood into the shed closer to the house and splitting kindling until he figured he had enough kindling to start a conflagration across the whole state of Maine. The maples shivered into their new finery. The oak leaves wrinkled at the edges, though they had no notion of going anywhere for quite a long while. Turner felt a kind of unhappy kinship with them. Still, every day at the ringing of the 3 congregational bells, Turner left his kindling and set off to Mrs. Cobb's house, and every afternoon Lizzie would be there. Mrs. Cobb never asked for Mr. Milton and Mr. Addison any more. Instead, Turner would play and Lizzie would sing, and then she would disappear out the backyard, and Turner would wave to Mrs. Hurd, and he'd settle himself for the silent supper, and the still more silent evening. School would begin soon in Phippsburg, and although he would not be attending, Reverend Buckminster believing that a minister's son should learn at home under the tutelage of his ministerial father, he was already beginning to read the theology that would soon be a part of his curriculum. Nathaniel Emmons, on some of the first principles and doctrines of true religion. Lord save us all, thought Turner when he hefted the volume. One day, after the frost had hinted that it might be on its way soon, Turner came out of the woods above Phippsburg, where aspens had bleached to a dull yellow beige, and the pines were starting to look haughty in their greenery, and he figured he had better be at Mrs. Cobb's. He sprinted on down, and he might have been there on time if he hadn't been struck by something about as expected as a megalosaurus lumbering up Parker Head. The door and shutters of Mrs. Hurd's house had been painted green. He walked across the street and onto her porch. The paint was still glistening. He opened the screen door and rapped with the knocker, but he could tell right away that Mrs. Hurd would not be answering. The house was holding itself tight and lonely. Even its curtains pulled together and tied against the day. Turner walked around to the side porch. The shutters had all been painted there, too, and he found a single window whose curtains had not been pulled. When he looked in, he saw sheets laid eerily over all the furniture, and even on the carpet, as if an Arctic landscape had lifted itself and dropped into a parlor in Phippsburg. Even the wind seemed to be blowing colder, and Turner shivered. He stood that way for a long while. Mrs. Cobb was waiting for him with hands on hips. 3 o'clock, she said. Not 2 o'clock, not 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock. Here I've let that child in, and she's sitting in my parlor, and I don't have a thing to say to her. And Lord knows she hasn't a single thing to say to me. Well, I'm sorry, Mrs. Cobb. Mrs. Hurd's house looks closed up. All I know is that those awful shutters have been painted a Christian color. Turner could see that Lizzie was annoyed when he came into the parlor. Her mouth was closed tight, but her eyes said, Turner, Ernest, Buckminster, if I had to sit in this parlor alone with her for 1 more minute, I'd have thrown something through a window, and it would have been your fault. Turner got right down to his playing. But the green shutters hung before him, and his fingers seemed to miss half the time, and toward the end of just about every chorus he found that his feet had stopped pumping and that the verses were drifting off into a strangling silence. Turner Buckminster, you keep your mind on God's songs. He did try, but Mrs. Cobb got more and more exasperated. Are you trying to send me into my last words? She finally hollered. Lizzie's eyes grew big, and Turner figured he didn't want Mrs. Cobb to die on him, so he picked up the pace with a few Civil War hymns, but even so, she finally waved her hand and told him to stop. There was playing the organ, she said, and there was playing at the organ. If she wanted to hear someone playing at the organ, all she had to do was listen to that dreadful Lillian Woodward. It was high time for him to go on home and leave an old lady some use of her ears. Lizzie Bright stood up and walked over to Turner. She took his hand and led him out the back of the house. They stood together on the back porch as they had done so many times. But now, for the very first time, there was a gentle touch in Lizzie's hand that Turner had never noticed before, and he did not let go. You know, I was about to throw something through the window by the time you got there. I know. You know what it's like to sit in there not talking with her? Golly Moses! I kept trying to find a place to put my eyes so she wouldn't think I was planning on stealing something. Well, she wouldn't open the door for you every day if she thought that. She just doesn't know what to say to you. I know. Just like sometimes I don't know what to say to you. Lizzie, you never have any trouble knowing what to say to me. Well, Turner, Ernest Buckminster, right now, I'm trying to figure out how to ask you why a wild turkey could have played that organ better than you today. You still trying to figure out a way to ask? Well, not anymore. I guess it's right out there. I don't know. Me leaving Boston, what might happen to you and everyone else on Malaga, and now Mrs. Hurd's house. And then these dinners at home where no one says a single thing, not one single thing. I guess I just want one thing to stay the same. Just one thing. Well, she said, if you were still in Boston, you'd never have heard of me. Turner smiled. Well, I suppose some changes are as fine as they can be. Turner, Ernest Buckminster, you best be careful what you say. Lizzie took her hand from his, and she was gone. Turner went out to the street, looked at the green shutters of Mrs. Hurd's house, and walked back to the parsonage. The sea breeze, wearing its overcoat, followed him all the way until he closed the door on it. Then he tipped up into the sky and spread out, looking for a maple it could scorch or a beech it could blanch. It found the maple and went about its business, so that if Turner had looked out his front door, he might have seen the maple just past First Congregational shiver some and then coldly begin to burn into reds. But he didn't look out. He went up to his room and listened to the clicking of the typewriter from his father's study. And he thought about sunlight shutters and strawberry doors and Mrs. Hurd and baseballs hit higher than the dome of the Massachusetts State House and Lizzie Bright. And he suddenly knew that he needed to find a way back to Malaga Island. And he needed to find out where Mrs. Hurd had gone. So that night, as dishes were passed around the silent table, and as the clock on the break front chimed the quarter hours, Turner decided he would dare the silence and ask. Mrs. Hurd's house is all closed up, he said. He was surprised at how loudly his voice crackled around the room, as though it were electric and sparking up the paneled walls. And her shutters, well, they're all painted green. Yes, I know, said Reverend Buckminster without looking up. He deliberately cut a square piece of lamb and dipped it into the mint jelly on his plate. He brought it slowly to his mouth and chewed properly. The clock chimed another quarter hour. Well, do you know where she went? Reverend Buckminster slowly chewed. There was a long silence, so long, that Turner wondered if the clock might chime again. Yes, his father said, I do know. But it's not to be gossiped about at the minister's dinner table. Turner's mother put down her fork. Tell him, Buckminster. Tell him where Mrs. Hurd has gone. It is a family affair. More silence, then his mother said softly. Turner, Mrs. Hurd has been sent to the Home for the Feeble-Minded in Pownell. Do you know what that is? Turner shook his head. Well, it's an insane asylum, Turner. It's a place where people live in long wards, tied to white iron beds. It's a place where there are strong nurses to tell them exactly what to do. Turner thought he might throw up. The smell of the mint jelly filled the room, heavy and sickly sweet, awful, wafting around him. Well, you don't need to frighten the boy. But she wasn't feeble-minded or insane, his mother continued. I knew her, and she wasn't feeble-minded or insane. Well, that's for her son to decide. He is a deacon, after all, said Reverend Buckminster. For her son to decide, said Turner's mother, looking only at him, and for 2 other respectable citizens of Phippsburg to agree to, if she was to be legally committed. One of the respectable citizens was Mr. Stonecrop, who just happens to be looking for capital to build his new hotel. And my, isn't it surprisingly convenient that the good Deacon Hurd now has his mad mother's house to put on the market, all newly painted in colors that everyone expects? And isn't it surprisingly convenient that once it has sold, Deacon Hurd will have a nice sum to invest? Ooh, Turner's mama is getting really brave and bold, isn't she? Deacon Hurd, Turner, has been fearing for his mother's sanity for some time, and he cannot leave her safely alone. Well, you can hardly expect him to care for an insane woman, the Reverend said. Well, the other respectable gentleman who signed the committal papers, said Turner's mother, is best named by your father. And she gathered up her dishes and went out to the kitchen. Turner did not ask his father who the other respectable gentleman was. As silence descended upon the dining room again, and the ticking of the break-front clock grew louder, he, too, gathered up his dishes and left his father sitting very still, his hands on the edge of the table. His mother was gone from the kitchen. Turner stacked his plate atop hers and then went out to the front porch and sat on the steps. The days were darkening earlier now, but down Parker Head he could still make out Mrs. Hurd's house, or what had been Mrs. Hurd's house. I have some friends before me gone, he sang quietly, but the sound seemed so lonely and lost that he stopped before the chorus. He thought of Mrs. Hurd in some awful gown, confused and afraid, her hair uncombed in a well-lit ward under sheets white and starched, stretched tight across her chest. And he knew that she was thinking only one thing. If only she could light out for the territories. If only she could. Wow. That's surprising, wasn't it? All right, so Turner right now is feeling a little frustrated and sad for Mrs. Hurd, whose son has committed her to an insane asylum because they're wanting that money to rebuild the town, remember? So, it's a sad chapter, wasn't it? But it's not over. There's still more chapter 7 to go, but that's our stopping point for today. Remember, these are really long chapters. So we will continue with the rest of chapter 7 and maybe some of chapter 8 next time. Have a great day, guys.